So why don't we start with why don't we start at the beginning? Where did you grow up, and how did you come to be in the military?
Okay. I grew up I was born in Albany, New York, raised a little bit in a place called Schenectady. And my dad was transferred, he worked for General Electric. He got transferred to Bloomington, Illinois, where I stayed through elementary school and high school. And then I went to college. I had the good fortune to go to a small liberal arts college in Beloit, Wisconsin, called Beloit College. And in the latter part of my schooling there, that was around 1965, became more and more aware of what was going on in the world and specifically how we fit into the world and what our perceived responsibilities are to our country. And I looked at the military as the way of doing that. My brother had gone into the Marine Corps. He's 3 years my senior. So I gave that a strong look and thought that I would try to be a Marine and a Marine Corps officer. So I chose to enter into one of the Marine Corps officer training programs called Officer Candidate School. Made that decision in November of 65. And then I started on active duty at Quantico in October of 66.
Hmm. And how long were you in Quantico?
At that time, OCS lasted about 3 months, and then you transfer over to what's called the basic school. And I completed that in May of 67. So I was in Quantico for probably 8 months.
Then you received your commission?
You receive your commission at the end of officer candidate school. So that for me would have been December of 1966.
Okay. What
But
happened after that?
well, then you learn how to be a second lieutenant, and that's called basic school. It's a compressed program of learning. And I think it was a wonderful learning experience. You learn all things about what you need to know to be a Marine Corps officer, an infantry Marine Corps officer, all the way from logistics, shooting 81 millimeter mortars, navigation, tactics, history, everything that the Corps thinks a person should be knowledgeable of. So when you get done, theoretically, you are academically trained to be an infantry officer. Other classmates went on to other types of specialties like tanks, artillery, logistics, supply, communications. But for those of us that said this is what we want to do, we went right over to Vietnam after completion of the basic school. It was almost assumed, I think, from the start of the basic school, and that would have been in January of 67, that those of us that completed uh, the basic school and had chosen to go directly into the infantry were going to be going to Vietnam. There might be a couple of exceptions, but they were few and far between. So most of us that were called 0302 would go directly to Vietnam.
And did you?
Yes.
And when did you arrive there?
Got there in July of 67. Very hot. We flew out of Sacramento, California, over to Okinawa. And I can remember sitting 3 seats behind, I think he was a major, and he had on he looked every bit the Marine, short haircut, long sleeve shirt, tie. And I don't think I was at that point, just no tie, open shirt. So there was a real gung ho Marine. But I can remember getting into Da Nang, flying into Da Nang, and reporting into uh, 1st Marine Division headquarters in that month. And I was assigned to 1st Marine Division. And I remember the tent that I slept that night before I reported in to headquarters. The Phantoms were taking off and landing probably about 300 yards abutting the place where I was trying to sleep. So that was a wake-up call. And then it was kind of crazy. I was walking up to the general's headquarters, and I saw another Marine who was running at me with a 45 pistol in his hand. And he excitedly shouted, "Did you see it? Did you see it?" And I said, "No, what? What?" And he threw a couple rounds into a nearby bush, claiming to have seen some type of a poisonous snake. That was a wake-up call. I said, "Well, that was different." And I continued my walk up into headquarters. It was the general's procedure to personally welcome and to talk to each officer that reported in. And I can remember him saying, "Well, Lieutenant Alton, we're going to assign you to Gulf Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. They had a unit that was just overrun 3 days before. So they're a couple of officers short." So those are 2 things, Michael, that I remember from my first day in Vietnam.
And you were there for 13 months, I assume.
Good assumption. Most Marines were. I took a brief hiatus for 2 months. Once after I was shot, I went down to Cam Bay for a month. Although that was in Vietnam, that was not in any way being in combat. And then another month in January of '68, I spent in Okinawa. I was at what's called embarkation school. Basically, you're training to how to load ships.
Okay.
So for the exception of those 2 months, yeah, I was in Vietnam.
You were a platoon leader?
Yes, yes, I was.
Mm-hmm. And how long were you a platoon leader?
I was a platoon leader from, from July of '67. And then after I came back from embarkation school, I was transferred to another unit. That's when we had the Battle of Hue in 1968. I went over to Fox Company, still a platoon leader. And then I was reassigned to be what's called the S2, or the intelligence officer for the battalion. And I did that for probably the last 3 or 4 months of my tour in Vietnam.
Hmm. Can you talk a little bit about coming home?
Once again, Michael, I consider myself so lucky to be talking to you today and just being here. I can remember some anecdotes about simply coming home. At the time, we were stationed when I was coming home on Highway 1. And this is we were just south of Phu Bai. So we're making our way down, both myself and one of the sergeants on my staff in a Jeep. And we passed by a place called Hai Van Pass. And we continued on, got into the airport. And later on that day, after my sergeant returned, got word that there was an ambush that was conducted on that very road about an hour after we had gone through. So just to be going home was a sheer lucky opportunity for me. Apparently, they decided not to spring the ambush on just one Jeep, but were waiting for convoys, typically frequented both going north and south.
Wow.
But then getting on the plane the next day, a couple of thoughts were stopover in Okinawa. And I can remember going by, we're in a bus going back, and I had I had a vision of the 6 by, the truck in front of me that was filled with duffel bags of other Marines. And some of the Marines were sprawled out in the most awkward positions, but they were all asleep. And the guy next to me smiled and he says, well, that's one of the things about Marines. You can always find a way and a time to go to sleep. That was, some of the humor was lost in the translation, but that's very true. Then when I arrived back into Travis Air Force Base, I had a friend of mine that was in college. Rather, he was going to graduate school. And Tim picked me up and we spent a night in San Francisco. I felt very much out of place going to a bar that was filled with many folks that took a different position on the war. So that was like 3 days before I almost got blown up in that yet to be sprung ambush. And 3 days after that event, there I was having a beer with people that were looking at the world in a different way. I was fortunate though, because from there I went to back home to Illinois, where my parents were, and my father and mother greeted me at the airport. I had no problems of antagonism being expressed towards me as often as publicized, but I was greeted as essentially a returning veteran. I think I got about a week or two leave, reacquainted myself with some of my high school classmates. But it was a quick hiatus there between coming back, and then I went down to Lejeune, enjoying the drive. I
Okay.
was in Camp Lejeune for about 2 or 3 months, and the unit was getting ready for a med cruise, but I happened to be living in the bachelor officer quarter, a room away from a recruiter who convinced me, or I allowed him to convince me, of the pluses of extending in the Marine Corps. And we have the reserve unit component of the Marines throughout the United States. And with each unit, there at least was what's called an inspector instructor staff of about 9 active duty Marines that would be responsible for assisting the reserve unit to conduct their training on both a monthly basis and the 2-week active duty during the summer. And that was very appealing to me. I thought in a loosely developed plan, I could choose a city of my choice and maybe go to law school. So that's
Had
the
that
plan that I envisioned.
had that been an ambition for you for a long time?
No, probably as I was aging a little bit more, looking more closely about what do I want to do with my life, that appeared to be really a viable option.
Okay.
So Milwaukee, Wisconsin was a point and an assignment that one could avail themselves to. And I remember the recruiter saying, there is another ancillary duty, and that is being a casualty assistance officer. But what you do there is to make maybe a couple of calls a year, advising the next of kin of the situation. And I didn't give it that much regard at the time. So I said, okay, I think I could do that. So in about September of 1967, I transferred to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and became part of the instructor staff there. My title was the assistant inspector instructor. So I had a boss, he was the CO, and my primary job became that of a casualty assistance officer.
Can you talk about just sort of the breadth, the scope of responsibilities besides the obvious that comes with that role?
Well, first of all, would be the volume. in the time that I was there, I made about a minimum of 125 calls. And such calls would be to notify the next of kin
Over what kind of period are we talking about?
until June of 71. Within that period of about 30 months, we made over 125 calls. But the scope of duties would be, not to underestimate what you said, would be number one, to professionally, yet in a supportive manner, notify the next of kin of what happened to their Marine, whether it be their spouse or son. And from there on, it would be all the things associated with that, from the notification, helping them to the degree that we could build a support base of significant others in their life to move through this process and to make sure they were connected with the other helping resources that existed. And then to stay available to them if they felt our help would be in any way of meaning and help to them.
Mm-hmm. So you would be involved, for example, or somebody on your team would be involved in making burial plans, that sort of thing.
Yes, yes. The way the general process would normally work from the time of the event, normally in Vietnam, of course, word would be passed from the veterans unit somehow to headquarters Marine Corps. From there, it would go to the reserve unit in which the veteran lived. And in our case, it would be, at that time, Kansas City, Missouri. Then they pass the word and information along to the inspector instructor staff. And then the word would come to, in my case, myself. But it was, stopping there, it really was a team effort, not only for the number of people that are involved in the communication process, but those that are going to be supporting that individual, the survivor. It would be, for example, when I made the call, I'd never do it alone. It would always be done in the company of our corpsman, Doc Smiley. I remember him very well. Wonderful guy. So both he and I would be making the call. Mm. And at that point, the funeral director would get involved. Of course, the next of kin would be identifying where she or he wanted the veteran to be buried. It could be in a military cemetery or a VA cemetery or their own cemetery, whatever their wishes were. And then to make sure, again, that the individual was connected with the other supporting agencies. Like the VA would be a big one, the Department of Veterans Affairs. So a lot of people entered into this very difficult time and were very proactive and supportive members of the next of kin.
I assume that your first visit, you weren't just kind of thrown into that, right? You shadowed somebody, you accompanied an experienced person before they made you do it on your own?
Yes. I followed, as you say, shadowed the commanding officer at that time. Wonderful guy by the name of Merle Sorensen. He was a major, I think. And I watched him both do some follow-up work with a very special case. It was a situation where a Marine got shot down over North Vietnam. His body had not been recovered. And Major Sorensen was trying to help the mother, who was a very outspoken lady, in trying to gain more insight and understanding and action that would resolve her questions. So she enlisted the help of congressmen and senators, as well as going through the chain of command. But that exposed me to the extent and the depth of the loss I think that people experienced. And then, yeah, I accompanied Major Sorensen on a couple of visits, and then it became my responsibility.
And do you remember the first time that you went out
Oh,
without Major Sorensen?
I can remember it as if it happened this morning or yesterday. It's you. We put on our blue uniform, our blues, and it was on a veteran that got killed the day before. So Doc and I got into the Marine Corps green station wagon, drove down to South Milwaukee, something like South 17th Street, parked in front of one of these wonderful duplexes that the south side of Milwaukee is famous for, and walked up and climbed up the stairs, knocked on the door, and presented ourselves to the lady. I'll just give her the name of Mrs. Wisniewski. She was an older lady, dressed in a printed dress, probably in her late 60s, and she had been acting in loco parentis for the deceased Marine. I don't know what happened or the story was with his mom and dad, but she was indeed the mother and caretaker. And she was the person that we had to say, I'm sorry to advise you that your grandson got killed yesterday in Vietnam due to hostile fire. I can remember that. I can remember the inside of the room where we sat, many of the details.
I've always imagined that by that point in the war, people knew what it meant when the green station wagon pulled up in front of a house and a couple of guys in dress blues got out of the car. I mean, that the whole neighborhood would have known immediately what you were there for. Was that not always the case?
Depends on the composition of the neighborhood. In this case, it was in the middle of the day and I did not see anybody else around.
Hmm.
Um, but very possibly people may have been looking out the window and saying, oh, geez, I wonder what's going on there.
Hmm.
Really, a lot of the situations were different. Sometimes, in our desire to make the notification as quickly as possible, it required visiting the place of employment. And there, those observations and reactions of other people were much more apparent and much more available.
Wow. I can't even imagine receiving that news at all, but receiving it at my place of employment would be, I mean, it's just unimaginable to me. What were some of the different types of reactions that you encountered?
Well, there'd be certainly a spectrum of responses, all of them emotional. On one side of the spectrum, it would be, I would say, a more listening response where the party would, on the one hand, I would sense that they knew what the message was, and they would more or less, not passively, but listen to me neutrally as the information was presented, and then to move along. Then it would be total surprise, saying, what are you here for? I thought you were a friend of my son. What? And then it would be total shock. Another response would be disbelief. You're kidding. No, this can't happen. No, not my son. No. Another response moving over on that spectrum on the far side would be violent reaction. And to look at the person that was carrying the message in as representative of all the things that that individual disliked in the government. So,
And by that time, we're talking about late 60s, early 70s. I mean, public sentiment about the war had become less positive.
yes, right. But I would say 99% of the time, they did not envision the casualty assistance officer as the cause of it, but just the recipient of the initial response of the emotion that would pour forth as a result of presenting that message to the next of kin.
How did your experience in Vietnam, just having to deal with loss yourself as a leader, did that inform your approach to these families, to this particular job? And if so, how do you think it translated?
I think by having been there and seeing men die made me keenly aware of what it would be like to be dying. But then, how did that help me to do my job? I would hope it would be a greater sense of caring and respect for the person that I was talking to. Nothing superficial, but everything invested that that person had lost. That was being much more aware of the loss, I think, and what took place.
You think they knew that you had been there?
Probably some did, because we wore, with our dress blues, the ribbons, the campaign ribbons, the Purple Heart, the decorations that we received. Not that probably, I'd say, how many Americans are aware of what those ribbons mean?
Are there other experiences that you remember very distinctly aside from that first one?
Let's see. This is providing me interesting insight myself, because I can remember that first casualty assistance call again, like it just happened this morning. But when I look at the others, I'm sorry to say that they're not as distinct. It's I don't know why not, because each one was equally important, but I can't remember each and every one of them.
Mm.
I do remember two others, though, that were somewhat different, because the cause of death was not as a product of hostile action in Vietnam, but one was a car accident. A Marine had parked when he was on leave alongside an exit on a freeway, but it was right before the exit started, and he was rear-ended as a part of a car that was just departing the freeway, going up the exit. And our Marine was changing the tire, so he was killed by form of a traffic accident. Another one, at that time, again, it wasn't a result of hostilities in Vietnam. It was race riots that were going on in Japan within the Marine Corps. And one young man got killed in a riot. And
By another Marine.
by another Marine. So I had advised his dad. Now, I do remember that one quite clearly. He worked for one of the telephone companies in Milwaukee, and we notified him at his place of work. And that was a total shock to him. He possibly thinking that his son was out of harm's way being in Japan, not Vietnam, only to learn of the situation. So I do remember that one quite well.
I don't know how big a city Milwaukee was at that time, but it seems to me that if you were living in Milwaukee, you were living in this community in which you were also serving it. You may have had to deliver this news to someone you knew or someone, 1 or 2 degrees of separation away.
Mm. I was fortunate, Michael, along those lines, not to have made the casualty assistance call with anybody that I knew directly. But I can say to the character of South Milwaukee, it was a very patriotic area. I think I had some friends on the Marine Corps recruiting staff, and they had no problems meeting their quota for the most part, even during the late 60s and the early 70s, which speaks again to the patriotism that was more than just words. These people followed up on it and they said, yeah, we'll enlist, we'll join the service. And if we're going to join the service, we're going to join what we think is the best outfit, the Marine Corps. So,
How did you come to leave this job?
um, I had at that time, let's see, this is 1971, framing it for us around the middle part. And I think the war was starting to wind down because the Marine Corps had offered early out programs to those Marines that were not intending on making the Marine Corps their career. Uh, so I took advantage of one of those early out opportunities. And my 3 year extension was reduced to 2 years, about 2.5 years. So again, I sought an early out from the Marine Corps. I recognize and respect greatly the Marine Corps, but I'm still processing our role in Vietnam and the outcome of that. But I think I internalized a lot of the emotion. I was living with 2 other guys who were active duty in the Navy, and we were sharing a house in the northern part of Milwaukee. And I had a bleeding ulcer. Matter of fact, I had almost passed out because of the blood that I lost. And one of the many lucky things that happened to me just at that time, our landlord, very nice guy that was living next door, knocked on the door. And I was able to crawl over the door, open it, and he looked at me. I was on my all fours, white as a sheet. And he said, my gosh, what's wrong with you? And I said, I don't know. And I more or less passed out. So he called the ambulance, and I went to a private hospital and transferred to the VA hospital. And I had diagnosed as a bleeding ulcer, and I was bleeding rather considerably internally. And I attribute that bleeding, the ulcer, to the stress in large part that I was suppressing or not handling well. Drinking only goes so far in handling that thing. So it resulted in what's called a gastrectomy. Part of my stomach was removed. And then the stitches from that operation separated, and I was operated again a second time, and more was taken out. So I was almost boarded out of the Marine Corps, but considered competent, physically capable of continuing to do my duties until I got out. So that's one of the impacts doing that type of duty had on me.
When you left the Marine Corps, when was it, and where did you go, and what did you do next?
I met a friend of mine who said, "Hey, Tracy, have you heard about this thing called the GI Bill? And I said, what's that? And he said, the VA will give you money for going to school. And I said, you mean a low interest grant, or rather a low interest loan? And he said, no, this is actually money you get for going to school. And I said, Dan, you got to be kidding me. What? And he said, why don't you go down to the VA and talk to him? I had not even heard of the VA nor what this agency was. So I went down to the regional office in Milwaukee at 342 North Water Street and talked to the gentleman who was called a Veterans Benefits Counselor. He answered my questions, introduced me to the GI Bill. And then we started just chatting back and forth and kind of hit it off. And he said, what are you doing after you get out of the Marine Corps? And I said, well, I'm looking for employment now. And he said, you ever thought being a Veterans Benefits Counselor? I said, no, but that looks like a good job. You're helping people, you're helping veterans. So one thing led to another, and I started working for the VA. And I did that in different roles, but my primary role in the end was working as a vocational rehabilitation counselor. And we had a wonderful vocational rehab program that would help veterans, service-connected disabilities, get into employment that met who they are as a person, as well as their limitations by their conditions. So that's what I did for about 20 years.
Are you still involved today with any veterans groups or causes?
Believe it or not, yes. I volunteer with the DAV. Every other Wednesday, we take vets who live in Green Bay down to Milwaukee to their specialty clinics if they have an appointment and need transportation assistance. There are certain stimulus that provoke those memories, like being in a room with flowers and just the scent of floral arrangements within a room will immediately take me back to those 30 months. Or the smoke of candles in a church. Oh, that's a stimulus for whatever reason, will cause me to think about that again. Let alone to look at the headlines today and to see people talking not flippantly, but more openly about possibility of war. A part of me says, well, do you realize what that means? Do you realize what you're talking about? And I think sometimes people that make that statement using war as an option, and I'm not saying it's not, I think we have to have a strong military in order to survive, but not to get political. I find myself as a part of thinking of a response to a person who presents that is asking, I don't ask him that, but that too is just that dialogue is a trigger for me to get back and remember what it looked like in the eyes of Mrs. Wisniewski, who just lost her grandson, and all of the many other people that paid the ultimate price.